Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. The first sign of winter on the frontier was not always snow, but silence. The prairie, so often filled with the wind moving through tall grass, grew still. The forest, usually alive with the crack of branches and the call of birds, hushed into waiting. Even the air smelled different, sharper, colder, carrying the faint metallic tamps of frost. And then, without ceremony, the snow began to fall. Pause. Here. Imagine yourself standing outside a rough wooden shack, the boards thin, the roof patched with shingles and hides. The horizon stretches wide, endless, the sky pale and gray. At first, only a few flakes drift downward, soft as feathers, melting when they touch your hand. Then the air fills with them, thousands upon thousands, turning the world into a curtain of white. The ground disappears, the path fades, and the only sound is the faint hiss of snow against wood. For those living in the Wild West, the first snow was a reminder of trials ahead. It told of long nights when fires must be fed without pause, of mornings when doors were frozen shut, of weeks when travel was impossible and food scarce. Families who had worked all summer and autumn to gather stores now measured them again, counting sacks of flour, barrels of beans, strips of dried venison. Nothing could be wasted. Every crumb was survival. Pause again. You see the inside of the cabin. The shelves are rough planks nailed to beams, lined with jars and sacks. A barrel of salt pork stands in the corner, its brine sharp in the air. Bags of cornmeal, their tops tied with twine, lean against one wall above the hearth. Herbs hang from rafters, their scent faint but bitter. The fire glows, but the room is dim, its corners filled with shadow. The snow kept falling. On the prairie, drifts rose high enough to bury fences, to block cabin doors, to swallow trails. Horses sank to their knees in it, wagons stalled, cattle grew thin in fields where grass was lost. For days, the world was silent, but for the crack of ice and the muffled groan of wood under weight. To live here meant to endure not storms alone, but the silence after weeks of cold air that crept through every seam of a cabin of frost, that clung to blankets of water that froze in pails before morning. Sleep, too, was reshaped. Families pulled beds closer to the hearth, layering quilts, furs, and hides. Children huddled together beneath blankets, their breath rising as clouds in the air. Adults lay with ears half awake, listening for the fire's crackle, rising often, to add wood, to stir coals, to keep darkness from pressing too close. Nights were long, and sleep came in fragments, woven between labor and vigilance. Pause once more. Picture yourself lying beneath a heavy quilt. The straw mattress beneath you creaks as you shift. The air near the wall is so cold you feel it bite your face, and so you pull the blanket higher. The fire glows faintly across the room, shadows bending against beams. Outside, the wind moans across the plain, but inside, only the steady crackle of wood keeps silence at bay. The first snow was also a test of preparation. Those who had cut enough would stack it high against the cabin wall. Those who had not felt fear settled quickly as piles dwindled. Families checked roofs for leaks, patched gaps with rags and mud, sealed windows with hides. Every weakness in the cabin became clear when frost slipped through, when wind whistled, the snow pressed heavy against walls. Yet, for all its hardship, the first snow also carried awe. Travelers wrote of how silence deepened so greatly that a man could hear his own heartbeat. Diaries speak of moonlight on drifts so bright it seemed like day, of skies filled with stars sharper than any summer night, a forest where every branch glittered as though coated in glass. Survival was brutal, but beauty lingered beside it, reminding those who endured that even in the hardest winters, wonder had not vanished. Pause again. You stand at the cabin door at midnight, the snow deep, the world pale with moonlight. Air is sharp, biting, but the sight is vast. The plain glittering, the horizon endless, the stars so close they seem to whisper. You breathe deeply, the cold burning your lungs, and for a moment, silence feels less like burden, more like presence, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like snow across open fields on the frontier. Did the first snow mark the beginning of hardship alone? Or was it also a reminder that silence, though heavy, carried its own kind of fragile beauty? Asterisk, the storm passes, but the silence remains. The snow outside lies deep, piled high against fences, pressed hard against the cabin walls. The sky is pale and clear now, the stars sharp above the prairie, their light glinting on drifts that stretch endless to the horizon. Inside, the fire burns low, and the rhythm of survival begins in earnest. Pause here. Imagine the cabin at dusk. The shutters are drawn, the door sealed tight against wind. The hearth glows with embers, casting soft orange across rough-hewn beams. The air smells of smoke, of damp wool, of pine sap still clinging to fresh split logs. You hear the crackle of firewood, the sigh of steam rising from a kettle. Beyond that, silence presses in heavy, broken only by the faint groan of the wind against the walls. In the Wild West, fire was more than warmth. It was survival itself. Families tended it with vigilance, feeding it through day and night, guarding embers as though they were treasure. A single lapse could mean waking to frost on blankets, two frozen water in pails, two bodies stiff with cold. And so the fire became a companion, a presence that shaped every night. Pause again. You hear the scrape of a poker against the hearth, the faint hiss as sparks leap upward, the whisper of logs collapsing into embers. The glow brightens, shadows bend, the air warms slightly. The silence retreats a little, though it waits still. Just beyond the door, wood had been gathered in autumn, cut into cords, stacked high against the cabin wall. Oak, hickory, pine, each split with axes, each carried in weary arms. But no matter how high the pile, it seemed to vanish quickly in winter. Its families measured nights in logs, their stacks shrinking steadily, their work of summer felt again in every burning flame. A winter poorly prepared meant dread, as each armful carried inside left the stack lower, its future more uncertain. For children, the fire was lessened as much as warmth. They learned to carry sticks, to blow gently on embers, to guard flames carefully. To let the fire die was unthinkable, and so even the youngest kept watch in their own way, its eyes fixed on the glow, ears tuned to its crackle. The hearth was not only center of warmth, but of memory, its presence binding families together in the heart of silence. Pause once more. Catch your child sitting cross-legged on the floor, their face lit by firelight, their breath rising faintly in the warm air. They lean close, poking carefully at embers with a stick, their expression solemn, their patience steady. The fire glows against their cheeks, the silence deepens around them, and for a moment, cabin feels like the whole of the world. Fire carried danger, too. Cabins, built of logs and chinked with straw or mud, could catch easily. A single spark, leaping to fabric, a coal rolling across floorboards. Families slept lightly, ears tuned to its rhythm, eyes half open to its glow. The fire was guardian, but it was also threat, demanding respect as much as care. At night, sleep came in fragments. Parents rose often to add wood, to stir coals, to keep the flame alive. The sound of boots on wooden floors, the creak of logs placed on embers, the faint rush of flame. These became part of the rhythm of survival. Sleep was never whole, but broken by vigilance, stitched together with the fire's crackle. Pause. Again. Imagine waking in deep night. The fire has burned low, its glow faint, its warmth thin. You rise, shivering, your breath clouding in air colder than blankets can hold. You kneel at the hearth, stir the embers, add wood, and watch as flames rise once more, pushing shadows back. The glow spreads across the cabin, the silence eases, and you lie down again, your body warmer, your sleep returning. Beyond warmth, the fire was sustenance. Meals were boiled in iron pots, bread baked on stones, beans simmered with pork. The smell of food mingled with smoke, filling cabins with comfort even in hardship. Yet meals were simple, repetitive, stretched thin. Hunger remained near, but fire turned small stores into survival, transforming scraps into nourishment. And so the hearth was more than necessity. It was memory, ritual, companionship. Families gathered around it in evenings, voices rising in hymns, in stories, in prayers. The fire lit their faces, softened their words, carried their presence into silence. Outside, the prairie lay endless and still. Inside, the hearth glowed steady, a fragile circle of endurance against winter's weight. Pause once more. You sit again before the fire, the silence pressing beyond the walls, the glow steady at your feet. The air smells of smoke and bread. Your body warms in its reach. Your eyes grow heavy. Aside, frost glitters in moonlight. The world vast and cold. Inside, the fire waits, patient, steady, live. And you are left with a reflection that drifts like smoke into rafters. In the Wild West was survival truly held in cabins and fields, or in the fragile flames that burned through night, carrying life forward one ember at a time. The storm has passed, but the nights remain long. Darkness falls early on the prairie, the horizon swallowing the last traces of sun before supper is finished, leaving cabins lit only by fire and candle. The wind moans across open fields, rattling, shudders, pressing cold through every seam. Within, families settle into rhythms of endurance, their lives measured not in hours, but in nights survived. Pause here. Imagine lying on a straw mattress near the hearth. Quilts are layered heavy upon you, stitched from scraps of wool and cloth gathered over years. The air at your face is cold, your breath visible, even beneath blankets. The fire glows faintly across the room, its warmth reaching only so far. Outside, the wind groans, the snow creaks under its own weight, the world pressed into silence. Sleep comes not in comfort, but in fragments. A bargain struck with the cold. Cabins were small, their walls thin, their seams imperfect. Frost crept across windows, patterns of white spreading like veins of glass. Doors froze shut, their hinges stiff, their frames swollen with ice. Families pressed closer to fire, shifting beds nearer, huddling together for warmth. Children curled beneath hides, their bodies pressed for shared heat. Adults rose often through the night, adding wood, checking livestock, listening for danger. Sleep was shallow, but it was enough to carry bodies into dawn. Pause again. You hear the crack of wood in the hearth, the quiet sigh of flame rising higher. You hear the shuffle of blankets, the whisper of someone rising, their boots soft on the floorboards. The cabin is dim, the fire small, but its glow is constant, steady, alive. Danger in winter was not only cold, but fire itself. A single spark on blanket or floorboard could turn survival into ruin. Families guarded flame carefully, covering coals, watching embers, keeping buckets of water near though they froze quickly in pails. The fire was both a guardian and threat, its presence demanding patience, its absence unthinkable. And yet, winter nights were more than labor. Around the fire, stories were told of journeys westward, of battles survived, of homelands left behind. Hymns rose into rafters, their voices soft, their tones steady. Children listened with wide eyes, their breaths slow, their dreams shaped by voices of parents. In the silence of prairie nights, sound carried farther, filling corners with presence, where emptiness might have lingered. Pause once more. Picture a family gathered close, faces lit by firelight, shadows dancing against logs. A father's voice rises in story. A mother hums a hymn. A child laughs faintly before sleep. The fire glows steady, its crackle blending with voices. Outside, the wind moans, but within, presence endures. Still, winter tested patience as much as strength. Days shortened until darkness seemed endless, broken only by labor to feed fire, tend animals, stretch food. Boredom pressed as heavily as hunger, silence as sharply as frost. Some wrote journals by firelight, their quills scratching faintly. Others carved wood, patched clothes, stitched quilts. Each act was as much distraction as necessity, a way to keep spirits steady in nights that seemed to stretch without end. Nights of endurance also carried fear. Wolves prowled near cabins, their howls sharp in stillness, their presence felt in. Tracks pressed into snow, bandits sometimes traveled in storms, seeking shelter or prey. Families barred doors with timber, kept rifles near, slept lightly with ears tuned for sounds beyond fire. Winter pressed danger closer, even as silence deepened. Pause again. Imagine waking to the sound of a howl carried across fields. The fire glows faintly, the cabin still, but outside, the sound lingers. You listen, your body tense, your breath shallow. Then it fades, swallowed by wind. You rise, stir embers, add wood, and lie down again. Your heart steadying with the fire's glow. For many, winter nights were endured, not only in silence, but in faith. Prayers were spoken aloud, whispered in corners, sung in hymns. Families asked for strength, for patience, for spring to come swiftly. Faith-filled silence, steadied minds, softened fear. In cabins where food was scarce, where illness lingered, where cold pressed too hard, faith became another fire, burning quietly, unseen but steady. And so, the winter nights of the Wild West became their own story, not of triumph, but of endurance. Each dawn was a measure of persistence. Each ember carried forward a proof of patience. Families endured together, their lives stitched by silence, by fire, by voices that rose softly in the dark. Pause once more. You lie again beneath quilts, the fire low, the night heavy. Outside, the wind groans across open prairie, endless and unbroken. Within, the cabin breathes softly, fire crackling, blankets shifting, voices whispering. Sleep drifts near, fragile, but steady, carried by the rhythm of flame, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like frost across windows. In the Wild West was survival truly shaped by food and fire, or by the patience of nights endured, one fragment of sleep at a time until spring returned. Asterisk, the wind is calmed, but the prairie remains buried, its grasses hidden, its trails erased. Inside the cabins, scattered across the Wild West, families turn to their stores, barrels, sacks, jars, and bundles, gathered in autumn with hope they might last until spring. Survival now rests not only on fire and blankets, but on what was, salted, dried, and set aside when days were longer. Pause here. Imagine stepping into a small cellar dug beneath the cabin floor. The air is sharp, colder than the room above, smelling faintly of earth and brine. On wooden shelves sit jars of dried fruit, their colors faded but still glinting faintly in dim light. A barrel of salt pork rests in the corner, its lid stained with brine, the smell sharp in your nose. A sack of beans leans against the wall, its cloth worn thin, its sides slumping with use. You touch it and hear the faint rattle of beans inside, hard as stones. For frontier families, autumn was a season of frantic labor. Corn was husked and strung into braids, beans dried on racks, venison smoked over fires, fat rendered into lard. Apples, if they could be spared, were sliced and left to dry, their sweetness preserved against hunger. Wheat was ground, flour stored in barrels sealed tight against mice. Every act of harvest was survival extended into months when nothing could grow. To enter winter unprepared was to invite hunger into the hearth. Pause again. You picture a woman measuring cornmeal carefully into a bowl, her hand steady, her face lit by firelight. A child watches closely, learning without words how each scoop must be counted, how each portion must be stretched. The smell of corn rises faintly as it mixes with water, forming a dough that will be baked near the fire. Meals in winter were simple and repetitive. Cornbread, beans, salt pork boiled to soften its tough flesh. Sometimes a rabbit caught in a snare, its meat lean but welcome, times only broth, thin but warm, its steam carrying hope as much as nourishment. Each bite was measured, each meal stretched, each portion planned with care. To eat too much too soon was to risk hunger sharper later. To eat too little was to sap strength needed for labor. Hunger was not only in the stomach, was in the mind, a constant presence pressing against every decision. Children felt it most. Their cries for more could not always be answered. Their bowls sometimes filled less than their hunger demanded. Parents gave from their own portions, their bodies thinner, their faces sharper as winter wore on. Hunger carved patience into every meal, teaching lessons harsher than any school. Pause once more. Imagine sitting by the hearth with a wooden bowl in your hands. The stew within is thin, its taste simple, its warmth faint but steady. You sip slowly, savoring each spoonful, aware that when the bowl is empty, there will be no more until tomorrow. Outside, the snow presses high against the door. The world silent but for the crackle of fire. Some winters were harsher than others. Letters and journals tell of families who boiled leather when food ran out, who dug roots from beneath snow, who stripped bark to grind into meal. Others told of neighbors who starved, of graves dug in frozen ground, of cabins where silence grew heavier when voices were lost. Hunger was not only endured, it was feared, remembered, carried forward into each harvest as warning. But hunger also carried ritual. Families prayed before meals, giving thanks, even for scraps, their voices steady, their faith binding them against fear. They gathered close around fire, bowls in hand, their presence itself a kind of sustenance. Hunger was not eased, but it was shared, and sharing made it bearable. Pause again. You hear the sound of a blessing spoken softly, the murmur of voices, answering the clatter of spoons against wooden bowls. The fire glows steady. The meal is small, but for a moment, silence loosens its hold. And so, the first stores of winter were more than food. They were a memory of labor past, proof of preparation, promise of endurance. Families measured their survival not only in barrels and sacks, but in patience stretched across long nights, in hope that spring would arrive before hunger grew too sharp. Pause once more. You close the cellar door, the smell of earth and brine, lingering, the memory of jars and barrels, heavy in your mind. The cabin above is dim, the fire steady, the snow pressed tight outside. Hunger waits, but so too does endurance, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like steam from a bowl of thin stew. On the frontier was survival truly fed by what was stored in barrels, or by the patience to stretch each portion, each bite each day into threads of endurance until spring returned. The barrels that once seemed heavy now grow light. The sacks, once swollen with beans and cornmeal, sag against the wall, their cloth thin, their contents faint. Each trip to the cellar brings unease, not at what is found, but at what is not. Hunger begins not with empty bowls, but with the knowledge that stores are dwindling and spring is still far away. Pause here. Imagine walking down into the cellar at dawn. The air is damp, sharp with earth. Carry a lantern, its flame trembling, its glow casting shadows long across shelves. Where once jars lined the boards, now gaps stretch between them. A barrel of salt pork smells faintly of brine, but its bottom shows through, only scraps left clinging to wood. A sack of beans rattles hollow when lifted, it sounds sharp in the silence. You set it down again, more carefully than before, as though the act itself might make it last longer. On the frontier, hunger came in stages. At first, portions grew smaller, meals stretched thinner. More water added to stew, more bread baked with less meal. Then variety vanished. No dried fruit, no bits of sugar saved for children, no scraps of pork to flavor beans. Soon, meals were not about taste, but about survival, about keeping bodies moving in cold and silence. Hunger became constant, not only in stomachs, but in thoughts, shaping every hour of the day. Pause again. You picture a mother ladling stew into bowls, her hand steady, though her face is drawn. The liquid is thin, little more than broth, but she serves it with care, each portion measured, each spoonful counted. Around the fire, children wait, their eyes following every motion, their silence heavier than words. Some families endured by turning to the wilderness. Traps were set for rabbits, snares laid along trails, rifles carried into the woods in search of deer. But game was scarce in deep snow, their tracks vanishing into drifts, their bodies lean with hunger of their own. Fish, sometimes caught beneath ice, offered relief, but rivers were dangerous to cross. Their surfaces treacherous, their holes freezing quickly. Each attempt was risk, yet still families tried, for hunger pressed harder than fear. Others turned to what remained around them, roots dug from beneath snow, acorns ground into coarse meal, bark stripped from trees and boiled into bitter broth. These were not meals, but survival, filling stomachs enough to quiet pain. Diaries speak of leather boiled until softened, of candles consumed when all else was gone. Hunger stripped pride, left only endurance. Pause once more. Imagine a pot hanging over fire, its contents little more than roots and water. The smell is faint, bitter, but when ladled into bowls, it is eaten slowly, carefully, gratefully. Each bite carries little nourishment, but it eases the ache for a moment. The fire glows steady, though hunger waits still. The mind felt hunger as sharply as the body. Children cried for more when none could be given. Parents comforted them with stories, with promises of spring, with songs sung softly in the dark. But the silence that followed each meal was heavy, each family member aware that tomorrow's portions would be smaller still. Hunger was never only physical. It was the weight of knowing that what remained might not be enough. Communities, when they existed, shared what little they could. A neighbor might bring a rabbit trapped in forest, a small sack of cornmeal, a jar of beans saved. Such gifts were more than food. They were hope itself, proof that survival was not endured alone. Yet often, neighbors had no more than scraps, their faces drawn, their own stores thin. Hunger was a bond as much as a burden, pressing families together, even as it weakened them. Pause again. You hear a knock at the cabin door, sharp against silence. When opened, a neighbor stands with a small sack, its contents only a handful of cornmeal. Yet it is received as treasure, Gratitude spoken in whispers, the weight of gift heavier than gold. And still, some did not survive. Letters and accounts tell of families found in cabins, their fires burned low, their stores gone. Graves were dug in frozen ground, snow pressed over them, markers placed for spring. Hunger was not only endured, it was remembered, its presence shaping every harvest after. Families planted more, gathered more, stored more. Their labor bound not in plenty, but in fear of hunger's return. And yet, even in scarcity, rituals persisted. Prayers were spoken before each meal. Gratitude whispered, even for scraps. Stories were told to distract from emptiness. Songs sung softly to carry spirit forward. Hunger pressed hard, but endurance remained stronger still. Pause once more. You sit by the hearth, a bowl of thin broth in your hands. Steam rises faintly, its warmth easing your face. Around you, the cabin is silent, the fire steady, the snow pressing tight outside. You sip slowly, knowing each taste is precious, knowing each bite must last. Hunger waits still, but so does spring, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like steam into rafters. On the frontier was survival truly found in food alone, or in the patience to endure emptiness, carrying body and spirit through silence until the earth awoke again. Asterisk, the days lengthen slightly, though the snow remains deep. The sun lingers longer at the horizon, its light sharper against drifts that gleam like glass. Families, trapped within their cabins, begin to mark the change, though it is fragile, faint, not yet enough to ease hunger. Winter still rules the prairie, but somewhere beneath the frozen soil, spring waits. Pause here. Imagine standing at the cabin door at dawn. The air is sharp, cutting, but the light is different now. Less gray, more gold. Snow stretches unbroken across fields, yet its crust glitters, softened slightly by warmth of sun. You breathe deeply, the cold burning your lungs, and in the silence, you sense change. Faint but steady, hunger remains, though. The barrels are nearly empty, the sacks collapsed into cloth, the jars bare. Meals are stretched thinner than ever, each portion measured with care. A broth becomes weaker, bread smaller, portions divided more carefully. Hunger presses harder, but so too does endurance. Families know that each day survived is a day closer to thaw. Each night endured a step nearer to spring. Pause again. You hear the sound of a pot being stirred, its contents little more than water and a handful of beans. The spoon scrapes softly against iron. The fire crackles faintly. The smell is thin. Yet, when the pot is carried to the hearth, bowls are filled, hands steady, gratitude spoken aloud. As weeks pass, the wilderness begins to offer its first signs of life. Streams crack beneath ice, water seeping in dark seams. Birds return in faint flocks, their cries sharp against silence. Rabbits move again, their tracks pressed into snow, their bodies lean but alive. These are fragile gifts, yet they are taken eagerly. The first fish caught beneath melting ice, the first rabbit snared, the first wild greens gathered where snow has receded. Pause once more. Imagine kneeling by a stream, breaking ice with a stick, dipping a bucket into dark water. The sound is sharp, cold, alive. Lift it carefully, your fingers numb, your breath heavy. Behind you, the prairie stretches pale and endless, but in your hands, water gleams, its presence promise enough. Even so, hunger lingers. Bodies, weakened by months of scarcity, take time to recover. Children move slowly, their laughter faint, their play cautious. Adults labor with less strength, their faces thinner, their hands unsteady. Its hunger does not vanish when spring arrives. It loosens its grip gradually, releasing its hold only as soil thaws. as crops are planted, as animals grow fat once more. Communities, when they could, gathered in spring to share relief. Neighbors carried what they had: a rabbit, a sack of flour, a jar of syrup from maple trees. Such gifts were more than food. They were proof of survival, signs that hunger had been endured, not alone, but together. Gratitude filled silence, binding families closer, reminding them that hardship shared was hardship eased. Pause again. You hear voices gathered around a table. Laughter, faint but real. Spoons clattering against bowls. Side, snow still lies in fields, but within presence fills air once empty. Hunger has not vanished, but hope has returned, carried in sound, in company, in food shared. And so, the waiting for spring became part of the rhythm of life in the Wild West. Each winter brought hunger, each spring brought relief. Families measured their survival not only in what they stored, but in how they endured, in patience, in ritual, in faith. Hunger never truly left. It returned with each season, but so too did endurance, carried forward, year after year. Pause. Once more, you sit again by the hearth, the fire low, a bowl of broth in your hands. Outside, the snow glitters beneath the sun. Streams murmur beneath ice. Birds call faintly in distance. Hunger waits still, but so does spring, its promise faint but certain. And you are left with a reflection that drifts like mist across thawing fields on the frontier. Was survival truly secured by food alone, or by the fragile hope carried across hunger, binding each family to patience until the earth gave again, gave again. When the hunger was stretched thin and the nights weighed long, survival on the frontier turned to the endless rhythm of labor. Even in winter, when fields lay buried and roads were impassable, there was work without end. Wood had to be cut, water fetched, animals tended, tools mended. The cold pressed against every seam of life, demanding effort in exchange for endurance. Pause here. Imagine standing outside the cabin at dawn. The snow lies high, the air sharp, the horizon pale with first light. An axe rests against a block of wood, its blade glinting faintly. You lift it, its handle worn smooth, its weight familiar. The log before you is frozen hard, its surface white with frost. You raise the axe, hear the faint groan of leather at your shoulder, and then the crack, sharp, echoing as blade strikes wood. The sound carries far in still air, louder than birds, louder than wind. For families of the Wild West, firewood was life. No stack was high enough, no cord long enough, for winter devoured it quickly. Men spent hours each day splitting logs, their bodies straining, their breath rising in clouds. Children gathered kindling, arms laden with sticks, faces red from cold. Women carried wood inside, stacking it near the hearth, feeding fire through day and night. The rhythm was endless. Split, carry, burn. Pause again. You hear the sound of logs being stacked, one against another, the thud echoing across snow. You see the pile rising beside the cabin, its edges sharp, its surface crusted with frost. The work is weary, the cold unrelenting, but the sight of wood stacked high is comfort, a wall of endurance against nights that press long. Water, too, was labor. Streams froze solid, rivers turned to glass, wells stiff with ice. Families broke holes with axes, kneeling on snow, scooping water from dark sims. Buckets grew heavy with frost, their surfaces rimmed with ice, their weight pressing hard on shoulders. Carried back to cabins, they froze again quickly, if not placed near fire. Even the act of drinking became labor, each mouthful earned by strength. Pause. Once more, picture yourself kneeling at a riverbank. The ice groans beneath you, its surface cracked in lines that stretch across water. You strike it with an axe, the sound sharp, the spray cold. The hole opens slowly, dark water showing, rippling faintly. Okay, you dip a bucket, lift it carefully. Feel its weight heavy with life itself. Behind you, the prairie lies silent, endless, unbroken. Every task was slowed by cold. Hands stiffened, breath froze in beards, feet numbed in snow, tools cracked, leather straps froze, ropes stiffened into uselessness. Even the simplest acts, carrying water, splitting logs, feeding animals, became trials, each step measured against exhaustion, each hour pressed by frost. Survival was not only endurance of hunger, but patience in labor. Children learned quickly that work was as constant as fire. They fetched water, gathered wood, carried feed to animals. Their bodies were smaller, their steps slower, but their presence was necessary, their effort binding families together. Winter was a teacher, sharp and unrelenting, shaping patience into every hand. Pause again. You see a child struggling to carry a bucket, the water sloshing, the ice at its rim clinking faintly. Their breath rises sharply, their steps uneven, but still they move forward, the bucket heavy, the task necessary, the cabin door. They set it down, their arms trembling, their face pale but proud. And so, the labor of wood and water became ritual. Each morning, logs split, buckets filled, fires fed. Each evening, stacks lowered, barrels emptied, muscles aching. The wilderness pressed hard, but labor pressed harder still, binding families to rhythm, shaping survival one task at a time. Pause. Once more. You stand again outside the cabin, the axe in your hand, the snow deep around your boots. The log splits beneath the blade, the sound echoing across prairie. The fire within glows steady. The water wakes in pails. The silence lingers, but is held back by effort, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like frost across fields on the frontier. Was survival truly secured by what was stored and saved, or by the endless labor of wood and water, carried out each day in silence, binding life to land through patience alone? Asterisk. The sun climbs weakly over the prairie, but its light carries little warmth. The snow glitters beneath it, crusted and hard, its surface broken only by tracks leading to river, to woodpile, to barn. Life in the Wild West winter was measured not in leisure, but in tasks that stretched from dawn until dusk, each one heavy, each one necessary. Pause here. Imagine rising from a straw mattress before daylight. The fire has burned low, its embers faint, the air so cold that your breath clouds above you. You pull on boots stiff with frost, wrap a coat around your shoulders, and step outside into air sharp as glass. The horizon glows pale, the land silent, the world vast. Your first thought is not of rest, but of labor. Chores began with wood. The pile stacked in autumn was high, but already it has lowered. Each day required more, split from logs, frozen hard, carried inside in weary arms. The axe rose again and again, its sound echoing sharp in silence. The rhythm of splitting, stacking, and burning filled hours, each strike a thread carrying survival forward. Without wood, no fire. Without fire, no warmth, no food, no life. Pause again. You hear the hollow crack as blade strikes log, the thud as it splits, the creak of arms lifting, the groan of leather straps against shoulders. You see the pile rising, again beside the cabin, frost clinging to its edges, proof of labor completed. The silence beyond seems endless, but the rhythm of work fills it faintly. Water followed. Streams froze, rivers stiffened, wells crusted with ice. Buckets had to be lowered, holes cut, ice broken. Each trip was heavy, each step pressed by cold. Water froze again quickly in pails, if not placed near fire. And so the act of carrying was endless, repeated morning and night. Each bucket earned, never given. Pause once more. Picture yourself carrying a bucket from the stream, its rim crusted with ice, its surface trembling with each step. The handle bites into your hand. Your arms ache, your breath clouds before you. Each step is slow, steady, necessary. Behind you, the hole in the ice begins to freeze again, erasing your effort before the day is done. Animals required care too. Horses had to be fed and watered, cattle kept from freezing, chickens sheltered. Their bodies gave milk, meat, labor, eggs. Their survival bound tightly to human survival. Families trudged through drifts to barns, breaking ice in troughs, spreading hay, gathering eggs from nests stiff with frost. The animals breathed heavily, their presence warm, their survival as fragile as the fire itself. Inside, labor waited. 2. Clothes had to be mended, quilts patched, meals prepared. Women stirred pots for hours, tending stews that simmered from scraps. Children carried wood, fetched water, swept floors, stitched cloth. The cabin was no escape from labor, but another place where endurance was demanded, where every hand was needed, where silence was filled with work. Pause again. You hear the steady scrape of a spoon against pot, the faint hiss of steam rising, the whisper of thread pulled through cloth. The fire glows steady, but eyes are tired, hands weary, bodies drawn thin. Yet still, tasks continue, one after another, without end. Winter labor wore not only the body, but the spirit. Days blurred, each one filled with the same rhythm. Wood, water, animals, meals. There was no pause, no respite, no change. Boredom pressed as heavily as frost, silence as sharply as hunger. To endure was not simply to labor, but to accept monotony, to carry patience across weeks when every day seemed the same. And yet, labor carried meaning. Each log split was a promise of warmth. Each bucket carried a promise of life. Each stitch, a promise of endurance. Families measured progress, not in leisure, but in survival. The fire that did not fail, the animals that lived, the children who grew. Labor was weariness, but it was also hope, carried forward through silence and frost. Pause. Once more. You stand at the end of the day, arms aching, boots heavy, coat stiff with frost. The sun has set, the horizon pale again, the world silent, yet the wood pile is stacked, the buckets filled, the animals fed, the fire steady. Then the cabin. Presence lingers, faint but real, carved from labor itself. And you are left with a reflection that drifts like smoke across frozen air on the frontier. Was survival truly held in what the land could give, or in the unending labor of hands that split, carried, stitched, and endured, binding life to silence one day at a time? Asterisk, the nights of the Wild West were long, and the days that followed were not lighter. When wood was split and stacked, when buckets were filled, when animals were fed, still the burden pressed on. For survival was not the accomplishment of one act, or even many. The repetition of tasks without end carried forward day after day, night after night, until spring finally broke the frost. Pause here. Imagine yourself rising once more, before dawn. The cabin is dark. The fire burned low, the air cold enough to sting your lungs. You wrap a coat around your shoulders, pull on boots stiff with frost, and step outside. Sky is dim, stars faint above, the horizon pale with first light. Your breath clouds before you, and the woodpile waits, the axe leaning silently against its block. You lift it, feel its weight familiar in your hand, and strike again. The sound echoes sharp across frozen land, and the labor begins once more. Each task carried weight beyond itself. Splitting wood was not only for warmth that night, but for tomorrow, for the next week, for every night until spring. Carrying water was not only for one meal, but for all who would drink, for animals that needed life, as much as humans did. The burden was heavy, not because it ended, but because it did not. Each day brought the same. Each night demanded repetition. Pause again. You hear the sound of boots crunching in snow, of buckets rattling as they are carried, of logs thudding as they are stacked. The rhythm is steady, unbroken, repeated endlessly. Beyond it, silence stretches vast, pressing against every sound, reminding you that work is the only voice the wilderness hears. Some tasks carry danger as well as weariness. A slip of the axe could cut flesh, leaving wounds that festered. A fall into a frozen stream could mean sickness or death. Carrying too much, lifting too heavy, could break bone or strain muscle. And yet the tasks were not optional. Work had to continue, even when hands bled, even when bodies ached, even when spirits faltered. Survival was bound to labor, and labor to survival. Children learned this rhythm early, piped sticks, fetched water, tended fires, but their hands grew rough, their faces serious. Play was rare in winter, replaced by labor that pressed as constant as frost. Yet even in this, they learned patience, endurance, the rhythm of life that silence demanded. Pause once more. Picture a child walking slowly through snow, a small bundle of sticks in their arms, their breath rising sharply. They stumble, fall, gather the sticks again, continue forward. Ha! At the cabin door, they lay them down proudly, their face pale but steady. The fire inside glows brighter because of their burden. For women, winter labor meant more than hearth and meal. They patched clothes stiff with frost, stitched quilts from scraps, boiled water for washing when possible, tended to the sick when bodies faltered. Their hands were constant, their work endless. Journals tell of women who spun wool in dim firelight, who mended boots by hand, who boiled herbs into teas that soothed more spirit than body. Their labor was quieter than axes splitting wood, but no less heavy, no less essential type communities. When near enough eased burdens with shared labor. Neighbors gathered to cut wood together, to clear snow, to mend barns. Voices rose in rhythm, songs sometimes sung, stories shared, silence broken for a time. Yet, when tasks were done, when neighbors returned to their cabins, silence pressed again and labor returned to solitude. Pause again. You hear the faint sound of voices singing together, their rhythm steady as axes rise and fall. Logs split, wood piles grow, laughter rises briefly into cold air. Then the voices fade, the sound softens, and the prairie falls silent again. What made the burden of labor endurable was not that it lessened, but that it carried meaning. Each log split was warmth for a child. Each bucket carried was life for an animal. Each stitch sewn was comfort against frost. The tasks repeated, but they were threads binding families to endurance, weaving survival into every day. And so, winter became not a single trial, but a chain of burdens, each link carried forward by patience. Families measured life not in comfort, but in continuity. The fire that did not fail, the animals that lived, the children who grew. The wilderness pressed hard, but labor pressed harder still, binding life to silence until spring returned. Pause once more. You sit again at the hearth, weary from the day, your arms heavy, your breath slow. The fire glows steady, the water waits in buckets, the woodpile stands high outside. The silence lingers, but it is held back by labor, by presence, by endurance, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like smoke into rafters. On the frontier was survival truly won by strength alone, or by the willingness to bear burdens without end, repeating them again and again until the frozen land finally loosened its hold. The prairie in winter was a land of silence and frost, but within the walls of cabins, another enemy crept quietly, Illness. When nights were longest, when bodies were weakest, when food was thin and air stale, fevers rose, coughs spread, and survival became more fragile than ever. The fire gave warmth, but it could not always keep sickness away. Pause. Here. Imagine the inside of a cabin at midnight. Its fire glows low, its embers red, its warmth faint. The air is heavy, filled with the smell of smoke, wool, and damp wood. On a straw mattress near the hearth lies a child, their face pale, their breath shallow, their cough sharp in the stillness. A mother leans close, placing a damp cloth on their forehead, her face drawn with worry. The silence of the wilderness presses outside, but within, the only sound is the crackle of fire and the frail rhythm of a struggling breath. Illness on the frontier came in many forms: fevers from stale water, pneumonia from cold, infections from wounds poorly tended. A simple cough could deepen into something fatal. A small cut could fester into sickness that spread through the body. Winter weakened all, leaving little strength to resist. And with no physicians nearby, families turned to memory, to herbs, to prayers. Pause again. You see bundles of dried plants hanging from rafters: sage, yarrow, chamomile. Their scent is faint but sharp, filling the air when steeped in boiling water. A pot simmers on the hearth, its steam rising slowly, carrying with it both hope and uncertainty. Women often became healers, their knowledge carried through generations. Willow bark, steeped for fever; pine needles, boiled into tea; garlic, pressed into poultices; honey soothed sore throats; onions drawn across skin to ease cough. These remedies gave comfort, if not always cure, binding love into every act of care. Sometimes the sick recovered, sometimes they did not. Survival was fragile, and illness reminded families how narrow the line truly was. When food was scarce, bodies weakened further. Hunger pressed against illness, sharpening its grip. Cough lasted longer when stomachs were empty. Fevers burned hotter when bodies had little strength left. Children often fell first, their small bodies unable to fight. Elders followed, their years heavy against frailty. The silence of cabins deepened when voices were lost, when graves were dug in frozen ground, when absence lingered heavier than frost. Pause once more. Imagine the sound of a spade striking frozen soil outside. The ground resists, hard as stone, the sound sharp in the still air. Snow is pushed aside, the earth cracked open, shallow but enough. The work is slow, the silence immense, the labor carried forward by grief. And yet, families endured even this. When illness came, they cared for one another with what little they had. Cup of broth shared, a prayer spoken, a hand held through the night. Presence became medicine, a reminder that even in silence, even in frailty, no one was abandoned. Illness tested not only bodies, but spirit, pressing families closer, binding them with care. Communities, when near, carried burdens together. Neighbors walked miles through snow to bring herbs, broth, or simply words. Their voices broke silence, their presence eased fear. Shared endurance became healing, reminding families that the wilderness, though vast, was not empty. Pause again. You hear a knock at the cabin door, faint but steady. When opened, a neighbor stands in frost, carrying a small jar of syrup, their breath clouding in air. They step inside, their voice soft, their presence a comfort larger than the gift itself. Illness, in winter, could not always be defeated, but it was endured, its weight carried through patience, through care, through the persistence of spirit. The fire might not cure, but it warmed. Herbs might not heal, but they soothed. Prayers might not end sickness, but they steadied hearts. Survival was not certain, but presence was. Pause once more. You sit again by the fire, the cabin dim, the air heavy. A child coughs faintly. A mother stirs a pot of herbs. A father adds wood to the hearth. Outside, the prairie lies silent, but within, life persists, fragile, faint, but steady. And you are left with a reflection that drifts like smoke across rafters. On the frontier, was survival truly measured only by fire, food, and labor, or by the fragile care shared when illness pressed hardest, binding families together in silence until spring returned? Asterisk, the cabin is dim, the fire steady but small, its glow trembling across rough-hewn beams. In the corner, someone lies on a straw mattress, their body weak, their breath shallow. Round them, hands move quietly, preparing what remedies the frontier could offer. The silence is heavy, broken only by coughs, by the creak of wood, by the faint hiss of boiling water to pause here. Imagine sitting at a small wooden table. Bundles of dried herbs hang above, their stems brittle, their scent faint but sharp. Mortars and pestle rest nearby, their stone worn smooth by years of grinding. Beside them, a kettle steams, its water tinted green with leaves. The smell of pine fills the air, mingling with smoke and wool. Someone stirs slowly, their lips moving in quiet prayer. Medicine on the frontier was not learned in books, but carried in memory. Women and elders kept knowledge of herbs, roots, and bark, passed from generation to generation. Willow bark steeped in water eased fever. Pine needles boiled into tea brought strength to the weak. Honey soothed throats. Onions pressed into poultices eased cough. Garlic, sage, chamomile, yarrow. Each plant had meaning, each leaf a hope. Pause again. You picture a cup raised carefully to the lips of the sick. Achaia, their hands tremble, their eyes half closed, their breath shallow. They sip slowly, the taste bitter, the warmth spreading faintly. A hand rests on their brow, cool against fever, steady against weakness. Faith was as much medicine as herbs. Prayers were spoken aloud, psalms murmured in silence, blessings traced over foreheads. Families gathered at bedsides, their voices steady, though their bodies were weary. The candle burning nearby was more than light. It was vigil, presence, hope against silence. In cabins where remedies could do little, faith became the anchor that carried spirit forward. Sometimes remedies brought relief. Fever lessened, cough eased, bodies grew stronger. Sometimes they did not, and silence grew heavier still. But the act of tending, of stirring, of praying, of sitting through long nights was itself a thread of survival. Illness might not always be defeated, but presence reminded the sick that they were not abandoned. Pause once more. Picture yourself awake at midnight, the fire low, the cabin quiet, but for the sound of breathing beside you. You rise, stir the embers, add wood, check the cloth on a forehead, whisper a prayer into darkness. The silence feels endless, but your presence lingers, a light as steady as the fire. Not all remedies were gentle. Mustard plasters burned against skin. Vinegar stung when rubbed on wounds. Purging drafts brought pain as well as hope. Families tried what they had heard, desperate to ease suffering, willing to risk discomfort for chance of cure. Sometimes these harsh methods helped, sometimes they harmed. But in winter, when choices were few, desperation carried weight equal to tradition. Neighbors, when near, carried remedies across miles. A woman might bring a jar of syrup, boiled from spruce tips. A man might share honey harvested in autumn. Another might carry herbs gathered in summer meadows. These gifts were more than medicine. They were presence itself, proof that illness was not endured alone. A knock at the door was comfort as much as the tea or salve carried within. Pause. Again, you hear such a knock. The door creaks open, and a neighbor steps inside, their cloak heavy with frost, their breath clouding. You place a small jar on the table, its contents amber, it smells sweet. Their voice is quiet, their words simple, but the air feels lighter. The silence less heavy. When remedies failed, grief followed. Graves were dug in frozen soil, snow pressed over them, stones marking places where spring might bring grass. Families mourned quickly, for survival allowed no long pause. The fire still had to be fed, the animals tended, the meals prepared. Yet grief lingered in silence, pressing against every shadow, remembered in each winter that followed, and still most endured. Illness tested families, but it also bound them closer. Each act of care, each whispered prayer, each shared remedy, wove presence into the fabric of survival. The winter pressed hard, but so too did patience, carrying life through nights heavy with silence. Pause once more. You sit again by the fire, the candle flickering near the sick bed, the kettle steaming faintly. The air is heavy, but your presence lingers, your patience steady. Outside, frost glitters in moonlight, the prairie vast and cold. Inside, care persists, fragile but unbroken, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like steam from a kettle. On the frontier was survival truly found in herbs and prayers, cussed, or in the quiet devotion of those who tended the sick, holding vigil through silence until dawn returned. Asterisk, the fever does not break quickly. It lingers, rising and falling like the wind against the cabin walls. Nights stretch long, filled with the sound of coughing, of bowls of broth carried carefully to weak lips, of prayers murmured in dim light. But slowly, steadily, the rhythm shifts. The cough grows less sharp, the breathing steadier, the body stronger. Where silence pressed heaviest, life begins to stir again. Pause here. Imagine the cabin in early dawn. The fire glows faintly, its coals red, its warmth thin. A child stirs in bed, their eyes opening weakly, their voice faint but clear enough to ask for water. A mother rises quickly, lifting a cup to their lips, her hand trembling not with fear but with relief. Outside, the prairie lies silent, but within, presence breathes again. Recovery on the frontier was slow. Bodies, weakened by fever or hunger, took weeks to regain strength. Children rose cautiously, their limbs thin, their laughter hesitant. Adults returned to work sooner, though their steps were heavy, their endurance short. The cabin itself carried traces of illness, blankets damp with sweat, herbs scattered across the floor, candles burned low at bedsides. Survival was not triumph, but weary continuation, life carried forward by persistence rather than victory. Pause. Again, you see a woman gathering blankets, shaking them into cold morning air. Frost clings to cloth. Steam rises faintly as dampness freezes. She beats them against a post, her breath rising, her hands steady. The smell of sickness lingers, but fresh air begins to creep inside, sharp and clean. Grief remained for those who did not survive. A child's empty bed, an eldest chair unfilled, silence heavier where voices once lingered. Families endured, but they carried absence with them, woven into every winter that followed. Each sickness survived was marked by memory of those lost, by prayers spoken not only for the living, but for the gone. Yet life returned as it always did. The fire was fed, animals tended, meals prepared. Work filled silence, shaping grief into rhythm. Neighbors came again, voices lifted in relief, news exchanged, gifts shared. Hymns were sung, their words carrying gratitude as well as hope. Illness had passed, though its memory lingered, its weight shaping patience, its warning carried forward. Pause once more. You hear voices around the hearth, soft but steady, their tones lighter than before. A hymn rises, its words familiar, its sound trembling into rafters. Children laugh faintly, their play cautious but alive. Its fire glows brighter, its warmth steadier, its presence more than flame. The wilderness did not ease, nor did silence, but families carried resilience stronger than either. They had endured hunger, cold, illness, grief. They had tended fires, carried water, cared for sick, buried, dead, decayed, and still they remained, their presence binding life to land, their patience carrying survival through endless nights. Recovery was never whole, but it was enough. Enough to plant fields when snow melted, enough to mend cabins when frost receded, enough to carry families into spring where earth softened, streams ran, and food grew once more. Illness was endured, not forgotten, its lessons pressed into memory, its presence shaping endurance that would be needed again in winters yet to come. Pause again. You stand at the cabin door in early spring. Snow still lies in drifts, but the stream nearby runs with water, its surface rippling, its sound sharp against silence. Birds call faintly, their voices fragile but real. Behind you, the cabin breathes differently now, filled with presence, with life returned, with voices lifted once more, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like breath across thawing fields on the frontier, where survival truly secured in remedies that healed the body, or in the fragile resilience that carried families forward, binding memory, grief, and gratitude together into patience until the next winter came. Asterisk. The wild West was not only harsh with cold and hunger, it was vast. Cabins stood far apart, their chimneys rising like lone markers against endless prairie. Winter did not only weigh on bodies with frost, but on spirits with absence. Loneliness became as constant as snow, its silence pressing heavier than wind. Pause here. Imagine standing at the cabin door at twilight. The horizon stretches wide, pale with fading light. No smoke rises from another chimney, no voices carry across fields. Only the groan of wind moves, tugging at shutters, rattling frost from branches. You breathe deeply, the air sharp, and feel how large the world is, and how alone one family can be within it. Distance was measured not in miles, but in days. A trip to the nearest settlement might take hours in summer, but in snow it stretched into days, the path uncertain, rivers frozen, trails buried. Families endured whole winters without seeing neighbors, without hearing other voices beyond their own. Silence became a presence, filling every corner of cabin and mind. Pause again. You picture a man walking miles through snow to fetch grain. His steps are slow, his breath heavy, the horizon endless before him. Behind him, the cabin fades, its smoke swallowed by distance. Each mile is weight, each step solitude, each day pressed by silence. For some, isolation carried peace. They found steadiness in quiet, prayer deeper without distraction, patience stronger without company. But for others, loneliness was sharper than hunger, heavier than frost. Women wrote of days spent without another voice but their own, of children whose laughter was quieter without playmates, of men whose tempers sharpened beneath silence. Letters eased absence, though they traveled slowly. Written by firelight, words scratched onto paper, folded carefully, sealed with wax, carried by riders across frozen land. Weeks or months passed before replies returned, yet families read each letter aloud again and again, savoring each line, each mention of kin, each fragment of connection. Pause once more. You see a mother by the hearth, her children gathered close, reading a letter from family far away. The ink is faint, the words simple, but her voice trembles softly as she speaks. Them, the children listen in silence, their faces lit by firelight. For a moment, distance eases, presence carried across miles by paper and ink. Asterisk's community, when near, was treasured. A knock at the door was more than company, it was life itself. Shared meals stretched long, news was exchanged, laughter filled the air. Neighbors brought small gifts, a rabbit trapped, a jar of honey, a handful of flour. Each gift was more than nourishment. It was proof that survival was shared. When visits ended, when boots crunched away into snow, silence pressed heavier still. Absence sharpened by its brief relief. Children felt loneliness most. Their world was bounded by cabin walls and snow-filled fields. Play was quiet. Their games invented with scraps of cloth or wood, their laughter echoing softly. They asked often when neighbors would visit, when trips would be made to town, when they would see other faces. Parents answered gently, but the truth was that day stretched long before distance was crossed again. Pause again. You hear the faint sound of a child humming to themselves as they stack wooden blocks near the hearth. Their voices soft, their play solitary, their eyes glancing off into the window as though waiting for footsteps in snow. The fire glows, but silence lingers beyond it, and so loneliness became part of winter survival, as heavy as hunger, as sharp as cold. Families endured it with stories told at night, with hymns sung aloud, with prayers spoken together. Sound became resistance, voices filling air that would otherwise be empty. Loneliness was never conquered, but it was eased, softened by presence, stretched by patience, carried forward until spring. Pause once more. You sit again by the hearth, the fire steady, the room dim. Outside, the prairie lies vast, silent, endless. Within, a hymn rises softly, voices blending. Presence filling space where absence waits, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like smoke into rafters on the frontier. Was survival truly measured only in food and fire, or in the strength to endure loneliness, filling silence with voices of one's own until spring brought neighbors near again? The horizon stretched wider in winter than in any other season. Snow covered the land, smoothing ridges and valleys, swallowing trails, turning the prairie into a white ocean without end. To step beyond the cabin was to feel how empty the world truly was, not only in sound, but in distance. Loneliness was not only inside, but across miles that separated families from one another. Pause here. Imagine standing in the doorway at dawn. The sky is pale, the ground gleams with frost. The wind moves faintly, stirring drifts into ridges like frozen waves. No chimney smoke rises beyond your own. No figure crosses the snow. The silence is vast, pressing, unbroken. You step outside, your boots sinking deep, and see only the endless sweep of white. Journeys became trials of endurance. What, in summer, was an afternoon's ride became in winter a struggle of days. Each mile heavy with snow, each stream frozen and treacherous. Horses sank deep, wagons stalled, paths vanished. A trip to town, to church, to a neighbor was measured in risk. Families often chose instead to remain within their cabins, their isolation deeper with every week of silence. Pause again. You picture a man leading his horse across a frozen creek. The ice groans beneath their weight, cracks spreading like glass. His steps are cautious, his breath sharp, his hand steady on the reins. On the far side, snow waits, unbroken, stretching into distance that seems endless. Even when neighbors lived near, the miles felt vast. A cabin a few ridges away might as well have been a town across the plains when storms raged and trails disappeared. Families spoke of going months without visitors, of doors unopened to anyone beyond their own. Loneliness was not absence of people alone. It was the knowledge that distance itself was barrier, that voices could not carry across the silence. Letters traveled slowly, carried by riders when weather allowed, arriving weeks late, sometimes months. Families treasured each one, reading them aloud, savoring each line. A single letter was company enough to fill many nights. Its words carried like conversation, repeated until paper wore thin. Yet, between letters, the silence returned, heavier for having been briefly broken. Pause once more. You see a family gathered near firelight, a letter unfolded carefully, its edges worn. The father reads slowly, his voice steady, his children listening intently. The words speak of weather, of health, of kin far away. They are simple, ordinary, yet in this moment they are treasure. Presents carried across empty miles. The miles weighed on children too. They asked often when visits would come, when they might see friends, when church would gather again. Parents answered gently, but the truth was that winter stretched long and journeys were rare. Children learned patience early, their games quieter, their laughter softer, their eyes often fixed on horizons that remained empty. And yet, the miles also shaped endurance. Families learned to lean upon one another, to fill silence with their own voices, to carry presence in absence. They told stories each night, sang hymns together, prayed aloud. Each act was small, but each one pressed back against distance, against silence, against loneliness that seemed endless. Pause again. You hear the faint hum of a hymn rising in the cabin, voices blending, their sound fragile but steady. Outside, the prairie lies vast, the miles unbroken. But within, presence lingers, carried in sound, carried in patience. Community, when reached, was medicine. A visit from a neighbor was more than company. It was relief, proof that distance could be crossed, that silence was not eternal. Meals shared, stretched long, stories poured forth, laughter rose into air, heavy with months of absence. And when neighbors left, when footsteps faded into snow, families carried memory of their voices like warmth, a shield against loneliness that pressed again. And so, the empty miles became part of winter survival. A T, they could not be shortened, could not be eased, but they could be endured. Families carried patience across them as surely as they carried water, wood, and food. Survival was not only against frost and hunger, but against silence stretched wider than horizon, emptiness deeper than snow. Pause once more. You stand again at the cabin door, the sky pale, the land white, the horizon vast. No figure moves, no sound carries, no smoke rises. Yet, within the cabin, voices linger, fire glows, presence endures, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like breath across frozen air on the frontier. Was survival truly measured only in fire, food, and labor, or in the quiet strength to endure empty miles, filling silence with patience until spring returned? Asterisk, the winter lingers, but slowly the light begins to change. Days lengthen, the sun rising earlier, lingering later, its rays sharper against frozen fields. The snow still lies deep, the cold still presses heavy, but silence begins to shift. For where the miles once stretched empty, voices now began to return. Pause here. Imagine standing at the cabin door in early spring. The horizon still gleams with frost, but faint smoke rises far away, curling from another chimney. The sight is small, but it is proof neighbors have endured, their presence still near. Your breath clouds before you, but your heart steadies, for silence is no longer absolute. The first knock at the door after months of absence was more than sound. It was relief, proof of survival, a reminder that distance could be crossed. Neighbors arrived with stories, with news, with gifts, however small. A rabbit trapped, a sack of flour, a jar of syrup. Their presence filled the cabin with laughter. Their voices carried across rafters, breaking silence that had grown heavy through winter's weight. Pause again. You hear such a knock, sharp against wood, startling in its suddenness. The door opens, cold, rushing in, and a figure steps inside, their cloak heavy with frost. Their voice rises, rough from disuse, their eyes bright with relief. The cabin grows lighter instantly, the fire warmer, though it is not changed. Community returned slowly, but it returned. Church gatherings resumed, hymns rising into wooden rafters, prayers spoken aloud, voices layered together until silence was chased beyond walls. Children rushed into fields, their laughter sharp against air, their play wild after months of solitude. Meals were shared again, stories exchanged, absence softened by presence. Letters, too, arrived once more. Riders carried them across thawing trails, their paper creased, their ink smudged, but their words alive. Families read them aloud, savoring every line, carrying voices across miles. Where silence had been constant, connection returned, fragile, but real. Pause once more. You picture a family around the hearth, a letter unfolded carefully, its words spoken slowly. The children listen intently, their faces softened by firelight. Outside, snow drifts melt, streams begin to murmur, birds call faintly in distance. Inside, voices linger, carried by ink, by memory, by presence. Yet loneliness never vanished. Even in spring, even with neighbors, the land remained vast, its distances unyielding. Silence always waited, pressing close. Once voices faded, once neighbors departed, once doors closed. But families endured it differently now, their patience strengthened, their hope steadier. The memory of company enough to soften nights. For children, the return of voices was joy itself. They played together in thawing fields, their laughter carrying far, startling birds from trees, quaking against cabin walls. Their games seemed louder than summer, their energy sharper, their joy brighter. To silence, sound was a gift, and they embraced it fully. Pause again. You see children running through melting snow, their boots kicking slush, their shouts rising into air sharp with thaw. Parents watch from doorways, their faces weary but warmed. The prairie seems less empty, the horizon less vast, the silence broken by laughter. For adults, presence carried meaning deeper than play, deeper than play. To sit again with neighbors, to share news, to sing hymns, to speak aloud without walls pressing close. These were reminders that survival was shared. That winter had not taken all. That silence was not eternal. Each voice heard was treasure. Each visit proof of endurance. And so, the voices that returned each spring were more than company. They were survival itself. Families endured loneliness not because silence was easy, but because they knew it would end, that neighbors would return, that voices would rise again. Hope carried them through empty miles, and presence rewarded their patience. Pause once more. You sit by the fire at dusk, neighbors gathered around, voices rising in him. The sound trembles against rafters, blending with the crackle of wood, carrying presence into silence. Outside, frost lingers, snow waits still, but within, voices endure, fragile but steady, and you are left with a reflection that drifts like an echo across thawing land. On the frontier was survival truly secured by food, fire, and labor. By the fragile voices that returned each spring, breaking silence, carrying presence, reminding families that loneliness, though vast, was never complete.